This is lecture 3 in which we're discussing space. And when we deal with space, if you recall from our first discussion, the idea of space was both a formal element and a relational element. So it is the same thing but functions in two different understandings. Space is measurable distance, and so it's the distance between points or elements, objects, shapes, whatever in a design. And we understand space because of how things are arranged within the space. We don't actually get a clear understanding of space, length, width, distance, or anything until we actually measure it or put boundaries around it. Then we have a better perception of what space is. When we deal with space, in the two-dimensional realm, we're dealing with one or the other of a type of space that is plastic, or the illusion of volume, or space that is flat and decorative. And so those are the two spatial issues we're dealing with in this discussion. Plastic space is pictorial depth. It is as I said, the illusion of volume. It is how things are made to look realistic. Whereas flat space, although it might have some depth to it via layering and things like that, it emphasizes the two-dimensionality of the space. And although we can have volumetric issues going on in the decorative space, as we'll see in some of the further examples, it is an overall two-dimensional understanding. So we'll look at plastic space first. And each type of space that we deal with two-dimensionally has what we call devices, and devices are the specific means by which we create a sense of space. To create a sense of plastic space, we use devices, some of which we've kind of touched on previously, but we'll define them a little further here. And they include things on this list: scale, proportion, overlap, vertical placement, atmospheric and linear perspective, planar recession, open form composition, and value. Scale, if you recall from the first lecture, is a relational concept, and it is size, the size of something. And so if something is big in an image that is meant to be the illusion of volume, it will be considered or perceived as being closer to you. Thus, when we look at this illustration of the floating piece of cake, the cake is huge compared to the cityscape. Pieces of cake on a plate with a fork are not that big compared to buildings. But in this space, the closeness of it brings us right up into our face, and then we have the distant understanding of the cityscape. And so this obviously is an illustration. It's volumetric illusion, and it's kind of surreal. It's playing around with some concepts there, and it's trying to communicate something or embellish something, but it's using scale to make its point. We also look at scale in terms of large and small in our relationship to it. Some things become monumental when they're scaled up, and this is actual scale versus the signage that's going on the facade of the building. Another thing about scale is we can take small things and scale them up or increase their size. And in doing so, we create a different understanding of those things or a different point of view. Here, obviously, we have the game pieces scaled up so that we're approaching them almost on a human scale basis, and they become characters or even architectural pieces in this photograph. And then, of course, the Monopoly dog is doing his thing in and among them. But our normal understanding of the chess pieces is that they're game pieces that we can hold in our hand. But when we put them in this kind of context, it becomes scaled up, it becomes monumental in the design space, in the picture area, and tells a different story than what we're normally used to. So we can use change of scale to really make our point, to really communicate certain things, to really focus in on certain things. Proportion is relative scale, or size in relationship to something else. As we look at the painting of this woman sitting on the rock, obviously she appears to be an appropriate human scale. Her arms are an appropriate length, her leg is an appropriate length, her head is appropriately sized or scaled to the rest of her body. She's sitting comfortably on the rock, and we have the sense of the scale of this facade behind her, so there's a relationship of part of, you know, the face to the face and the head to the rest of the body, so part to part, and then the totality of the figure to the totality of the space. As we look at this piece, it actually becomes much more decorative. This is a poster, obviously, and it's sort of set in, obviously, the late 20s, early 30s. But if you look at the proportions, the relative sizes of things, something's kind of off here. And obviously we have the woman sort of larger than any of the other characters in the piece, and she is therefore the foremost person in the piece. But if we take the size of the jockey and at that distance and actually bring him forward to be on the same visual plane as the woman, he's going to be a giant compared to her. And if we look at the proportion of the horse, we see that there's a huge distance between the rump of the horse and the head of the horse, and that is kind of out of proportion in terms of the reality of what horses generally are. There is no horse existing that is that long in proportion versus the height of the legs and the size of the head and so forth. So the horse himself is out of proportion, and the jockey is oversized in relationship to the rest of the people. Jockeys are usually little, he's huge. So that causes us to focus on the horse. It causes us to focus on him, focusing on her, and she's not part of the group that's focusing on him and on the horse and so forth. So there's a whole story being told here, and scale and proportion have been mucked around with for particular reasons. And then we have the unfortunate side of proportion, where things are put together in a way that they're just really not right. And so obviously, as we look at the woman here on the left, the mouth is huge. It could be her mouth, but it has been photoshopped in such a way that it is way oversized and too large for the face, and it actually makes the whole thing kind of a caricature and comical rather than anything that is fun, beautiful, enticing, lovely, things like that. So proportion really helps play into the idea of, you know, aesthetic beauty and so forth, because this is actually more comical and even a little bit shameful, if you will, compared to probably the original beauty of this woman. And why it was done, who knows? I don't know the language here. If you do, maybe you can translate it, but this is one of those things that can happen in Photoshop. When we want to scale something up, we go a little too far, and it just, you know, it's just wrong. This is one of those situations. Overlap is another way that we create deep space, the illusion of depth, the illusion of reality. And in this photograph, obviously, we have the ceramic animals overlapping the chair and tables behind them. The chair and tables are overlapping the facade of the house. The flower pots are overlapping each other and overlapping the column on the porch and so forth. And so by virtue of things overlapping, we create that sense of depth. Another use of overlapping in a photo, and this is actually seen, it's a bird's eye view, and we've got a couple bridges going across a pool of water, but obviously the overlapping the overlapping of the bridge portions creates some depth that they are on top of or above the water itself. And then the figures, of course, overlapping the bridge and the water itself. Vertical placement. In realistic drawing, even in elevation drawings to show particular details in a space, you're going to be dealing with issues of vertical placement. And basically the idea is that at regular eye level, when you're standing on the ground, things that are lower in the picture plane are automatically considered closer to you. Things that are higher are considered further away. For anything that's above eye level, anything that is higher is considered closer, and anything that's lower is considered further away. So as we look at this architectural drawing, we understand our eye level to be right about here. And we get that sense because these guys who are sitting down, yes, they're a little bit lower, but the guys standing up, we're kind of commensurate, we're kind of in relationship to these people here, and their eye level is kind of at this point in the vertical space. So it's about this far up from the bottom, the baseline of the image. So that puts us in context with the scene that we're viewing. And this is above eye level. This is actually a second story, and so this point is higher in the picture plane, and this point further away is lower, and that is true because it is above our eye level. But anything that's lower or below our eye level is going to be lower in the picture plane, and anything then therefore that's further away will be higher. So we look at this illustration, the trunks, the treasure chests, if you will, are lower in the picture plane. They're closer to us. They are perceived as being between us and the pirate who's standing with the attitude there in the upper left. And his relationship to the verticality of the space, this foot is planted at this distance from the baseline. These, of course, have less distance. They are closer to us. He is further away. Then these guys are mid-ground, kind of behind this guy who's already mid-ground. And they are smaller further away. And obviously we understand that because their heads are that much lower, even though they're further away, there's a ridge here that they are doing some digging, or they're in a pit, or there's a big sand dune that this guy's standing on. And then notice how high these guys are in the vertical space compared to this guy, and even these guys, and the chest. So the higher up we go, if we've got eye level going on, which by the way would be right here, so this guy's at our eye level, it is the higher up in the vertical space, the farther away the object is. Let me talk about eye level a little bit. When asked what the definition of eye level is, most people are going to say, well, it's the horizon line. And that is true only in the sense that the horizon line is always perceived at eye level, but that doesn't define what eye level is. It just can define where it is. Eye level is actually the distance from the ground plane to your own eyeballs. So if you're 6 feet tall standing up, you will have a taller or higher eye level than somebody who's 5'5" standing up. If at 6 feet in height you sit down on a chair, you have lowered your eye level. And if you lie down on the ground, you have lowered it more. If you get up on a ladder, your eye level has increased and you raise it. So eye level relates to the person, the individual. And every photograph is taken at the photographer's eye level. This illustration, the eye level is set by the illustrator, by the designer of the piece, and that eye level is set right here. So we're looking up at him, but down at his feet. We're looking down at these guys. We're looking directly at this guy's in line with our eye level because he's about, his eyes are actually about at eye level with the horizon. And so you get the understanding of what eye level is. And eye level is a very important understanding in linear perspective. But first we'll talk about atmospheric perspective. So in atmospheric perspective, that is the concept that things that are closer to you are really distinct, texture is really understood, colors are brighter, things like that. And with increased distance, things get fuzzier, foggier, hazier, less distinct, and they kind of start blending into the background. The reason for this is that the atmosphere, the particles in the atmosphere actually start to obscure our ability to see things clearly. It's like they create this fog or haze, and it happens because, you know, there's particles in the air, and so I'm from Southern California, and I've driven everywhere on the freeways in Southern California. So if I go out toward San Bernardino, if I go out west toward Ventura, there's a series of hills and mountains ahead of me. The furthest ones are going to be looking like this, and the closer ones are going to be much more colorful, much more texturized, much more detailed. And so the lack of distinction versus the greater detail, the greater color, are going to create that sense of deep space. Here's another photograph that uses atmospheric perspective pretty well. Obviously, the darker buildings, the darker structures are closer, and as we move into the background, everything gets lighter. And obviously, you know, the plane is there kind of against the sky and everything, but things that are associated with the darker areas are forward, and things that are associated with the lighter areas are further away from us. And notice we have a fairly low eye level here. We might be standing on the street corner, we might be even sitting on the curb possibly, because of how the eye level is working in here. Linear perspective is the idea that parallel planes will actually converge when seen in perspective, and they will converge at eye level. And so planes that are, when you're looking at something straight on, planes that are parallel will actually angle toward each other as they recede from you, and they gain greater distance from you. So as we look at this painting, we see the angle of the implied lines of the cobblestone streets, and they kind of line up with the angle going back into space here, and then the angle here. Well, the trick is that if you continue this line back as an implied line, and you continue this line back as an implied line, where they meet will be eye level, which is actually about right in here. The painter has placed our eye level on the same level as the couple walking, and they of course are the subject of the image. And so that eye level actually extends right about street level, where the street ends back here. So this corner of the building back here is below eye level, the rest of the building's above eye level. So this is kind of where your eye level is, and it does continue past the picture plane. And so we look at this building, which is actually depicted as a non-rectangular building. It's more like it's triangular because of the extremeness of the angles and how quickly they recede. But if we take the line of this lower edge and continue it so that it meets eye level out over here, and we take this receding line, it relates to the same vertical plane. This receding line is going to actually meet with this line and the line of eye level all the way out here. beyond the picture plane. So when we deal with vanishing points and things like that in linear perspective, the vanishing points for any given object do not need to be within the picture plane. Again, another architectural drawing showing the interior of a church or cathedral. And obviously linear perspective is going on. Things that are closer to us are larger, so things that are further away are therefore smaller. We get a sense of scale from the human figures here and what they're doing, and so we understand the vastness of the space based on that. And this puts us in a particular eye level. We're viewing this at a forced eye level that's determined by the artist. Open form or open composition is another spatial device that helps us create volumetric illusion. This is a photograph of a interior architecture trade show over in Sweden, and of course it's highlighting what they call the bull table or the cow table, and you can see of course that the legs of the table are somewhat bovine-like. And we have, of course, linear perspective, and we have obviously things cut off. So we know that this actually continues outside the picture plane. The tabletop actually ends outside the picture plane. The couple pairs of feet and the feet over here are attached to bodies that actually exist outside the picture plane. And so nothing is entirely contained within the frame of reference. So we know that things continue outside, and the image actually butts right up to the frame of reference, the edge of the picture plane. This is open composition or open form. It allows the viewer to actually participate in what's going on in the image. It's another use of open form in this poster, and the fact that things continue out of the picture plane, even the background color butts up against the edge. There is no framing device around the picture plane. This gives us a strong sense of dimensionality in terms of it being volumetric. It does flatten a little bit here, but for other reasons. Value is part of color, so value is a formal element of design, and value is what allows us to see form, to separate figure from ground, to see one form versus another form. And if you've ever appreciated a black and white photograph or a black and white movie or film, you understand that we don't need color to be able to see anything. So color is like an extra thing. But value gives us a sense of space in terms of lightness emerges out of darkness, and darkness will emerge out of lightness. So lightness comes forward, it advances out of darkness, dark things advance out of a light background. And we look at the panda, and he's sitting there or standing there mid-ground, and he is both black and white, and all around him is kind of a mid-value gray corresponding color. So if we took a black and white photograph of this, or translated this into black and white, all of the surround would be various shades of gray, and we'd get our whitest whites and our blackest blacks down here on the panda. So he is very distinct against the gray ground where he's white, and even where he's black he kind of stands out. Where the ground starts darkening in the shadows, we don't have a sense of clear distinction. In other words, his silhouette is not explicit. It's not explicit line in certain areas. It becomes harder to see. But the more things come forward out of a dark ground if they're light, or vice versa if they're dark, the closer they come to us, so that we can have a sense of distance because of change in value. Stronger contrast will give us closer understanding. Things are closer to us in the picture plane. If we look at this poster for the ballet company, the word Giselle is in white and it's against a black background. That's the closest element to you in terms of the spatial depth. And that comes forward, that's the first thing we'll see. Then we see the figure, and the figure is gray against the black. So there's less difference between the gray and the black than there is between the white and the black. So we have a spatial understanding. This is very much on the foreground plane. She is very much mid-plane, and the letter forms actually work on a mid-plane as well, and then the black is the background. Planar recession is something that actually overlaps into the other kind of space that we're about to talk about, but it is also useful in understanding and creating the sense of volume. And planar recession is basically the use of receding planes going straight back from you in space. So here we have a series of parallel planes. We have a foreground plane on which the closer trees, the darker trees, are placed, and then we have a plane behind it indicating some distance. They're slightly lighter. Then there's a plane behind that, slightly lighter than the one before it, the plane behind that, the plane behind that, and we keep going till we get to the sky. So the idea of planar recession is that there's a series of parallel planes that are moving away from you into space. Now this also uses atmospheric perspective, that things are less distinct and lighter as they start blending into the background. This also uses value contrast, darker coming forward and getting lighter and starting to blend into the background. So with any spatial understanding, when you're trying to go for volume, if you have one thing, like as not, you're going to have at least 2 or 3 more devices to help you along the way. This also has vertical placement and open form and all of those issues, but it's a real great example of planar recession. This also uses planar recession. We don't have a real strong sense of deep space, but we understand that she, the figure, is on a plane in front of the door. So this basically has a foreground plane and a background plane. There is no perspective angle in it really that's really detectable. There is no atmospheric perspective. It is an open form. Vertical placement doesn't really matter in this, but we understand that she is standing in front of the door and she is on a foreground plane and the door is on a plane behind that. So the planes are receding into space even though there's only 2 of them. So let's move on to the idea of flat or decorative space. And remember that flat space emphasizes the two-dimensionality of something. So to create flat space, our devices, our methods, will include figure ground ambiguity, scattering, repetition, detachment, edge tension, closed form as opposed to open form, and implied line, which we talked about in discussion 1. As we look at this surface design, this is a textile design, and we see a series of stripes. We see horizontality all the way through. There's no other direction but horizontal. We see a variety of colors, a variety of treatments of line, and a variety of widths and thicknesses. What we don't see here is figure versus ground. There is no which end is up. It is clearly just straight up surface pattern. And because it's ambiguous, because we cannot, there's no clues to give us a figure ground understanding whatsoever, the space is created flat. And the figure ground ambiguity, gives us flat space. So a lot of textile and surface design, when you look at fabrics, when you look at wall coverings, when you look at floor coverings, things like that, you will be dealing with things that utilize figure ground ambiguity to a great degree. Scattering is another way of flattening space, and this one scatters really well because everything is the same color that is being scattered across the yellow surface. But notice that in this repeat pattern there is no separation of groupings or anything like that. Yes, there is figure ground understanding, but figure ground understanding goes on from point A to point B to point C in the design. And basically we recognize the orange versus the yellow, and the entire space, the design space, is treated in the same way. Use of implied line. As we look at this illustration, we obviously have the fruits and vegetables rendered in volumetric illusion. So in and of themselves, each of those items is volume. So it's using value and light and shadow and things like that to help develop and present and communicate what those things are, what they look like. But as we look at the overall design, we notice, first of all, the issue of scattering. Everything is scattered pretty much equally across the surface. But then let's look at what the background element of the design is doing and how it's relating to the foreground. And if you look closely, you'll start to recognize the use of implied line. So we not just get the understanding of kind of these pieces on a ground, but the ground actually starts to interact with the actual figures. And therefore, when you have that happen, you start creating flattened space. And so let's start with one that's pretty obvious. If we take the turban squash and we look at the watermelon, notice that there's an implied line on the surface that goes between them. And that lines up with one of the ridges in the squash. We follow it straight down and hit the ridge in the watermelon. That relates the watermelon directly to the surface it's sitting on and brings the surface up to relate to that line on the watermelon. When you have a background area and a foreground area that kind of relate like this, the background comes forward, this goes back, and therefore you flatten space. Another implied line, right here, the wedge of Swiss is sitting right on that line, and that's picked up and carried on over to here. And notice also the implied lines that are pulling off, and these divisions of space are being pulled off from the cheese in a diagonal fashion, and how that's now lining up with the beans here, and lining up with the overall direction on the avocado. Notice the implied line here coming up from the shrimp and moving up, and now it associates and directly relates and is carried through with this division line in color on the squash. So the implied line is used to help flatten the space. Repetition helps create pattern, and pattern flattens space. As we look at this poster, we have, first of all, the figure, and we have a lot of gestural lines in the figure. It's actually more gestural than it is contour, and the repetition of all these linear elements help flatten the space. And the repetition of the letter forms as shapes themselves, the common color against the common color of the background, helps flatten the space here. And this Maori design, the same thing. We have repetition of the white kind of oval elements. We have repetition of the gray, almost paisley understanding, the curls and curves. And then we have repetition of the ground areas and the kind of coppery orange going on. So again, we have scattering, we have repetition, and that will flatten space. Closed form and composition is something that will flatten space. In this photograph we have, of course, a shepherd and sheep, and so we have a captured image. It's a photograph, and so it's the understanding there is obviously volumetric, but if we put a frame around it, we call attention to the two-dimensionality and we flatten the space. In this illustration, the framing device is definitely part of the piece. It was structured and contrived that way, and so this frame brings the attention to the fact that this is two-dimensional, And notice also there's a good use of implied line and repeated curves and things like that, and how things relate to each other within the piece. So we have a nod toward volumetric illusion, but for the most part it is flat space. Cezanne was very notorious for his spatial explorations and using edge tension. This is an open composition, but if you look at it closely, you notice some certain shape relationships. Remember, we talked in our second discussion about how shape relationships help evoke a sense of space, and Cezanne is using a couple of them here. Edge tension happens when one shape butts right up against another shape. That relationship will flatten the space. And so just by virtue of this piece of fruit coming against the edge of the plate, that area is flattened. Notice also that the right curve of the plate butts right up against the right edge of the picture plane. Remember that this is your entire design space, your entire image area. And every time you have something that is meeting and touching that edge or any edge in the picture plane, you're going to flatten space, because that alone is going to call attention to, hey, this is a two-dimensional thing. It's not actual space, it's virtual space. So edge tension is happening here and in here. Notice also his use of implied line. We got the tabletop going back. We've got this ridge on the chair kind of going straight across, meeting with the highlight there and picking up over here. Notice the implied lines here. Notice the odd perspective angles of the tabletop versus the set of the plate of cherries versus the set, or the angle, if you will, of the plate of, I guess we'll call that peaches. And then the jug itself is out of perspective. So and we're also approaching a bit of edge tension here. We're calling, because of the curve in the fabric, we're calling attention to the straightness of the edge. So notice how Cezanne has played around with space, rendering, three-dimensional volume in such a way that it tweaks and flattens space. Oh, one more edge tension is right up in here. The line of the tabletop versus the line of the dish. Cezanne is a lot of fun. You should take a look at his work to get a really strong understanding of what he was all about. But looking at how he manipulated space it's pretty amazing. This is out of the Bauhaus School, and it's a magazine cover actually. Lundgren is I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it's a German name that I understand that means upheaval. And the Bauhaus was about art and architecture and design. And so the Bauhaus artists and designers are people that you should be at some point somewhat familiar with. But notice the edge tension that's happening here as things are lined up, addressing the edge and meeting certain touching relationships. Those shape relationships will flatten space. The circle is overlapping this gray strip, but it's almost touching this larger gray rectangle, and that starts to flatten space. It's almost touching, but not quite, this line. Therefore, it flattens space. That touching relationship, shape relationship, will bring two-dimensionality to the entire piece. Detachment. All these figures in the Keith Haring illustration are separate and detached from each other. Nothing's overlapping. They are all working on the same visual plane, flat space. And also in this, as we look at how the letter forms are contrived and the type is put forth, there's nothing overlapping. Yes, the letter forms are overlapping the background. And notice that there's planar recession. Everything that is words and letters is on a foreground plane, background plane. Well, there's kind of a not quite middle ground, but beyond that is where all the people are, and behind that is, of course, the more textural area. So we do have planar recession in this, but notice that none of the letter forms overlap each other, and they all sit flat and help emphasize the two-dimensionality of this notice. So, what do you see? What spatial devices do you see in this page design? This is from the Canterbury Tales that was illustrated by William Morris, who was a designer of the arts and crafts era. Obviously, we have volumetric illusion starting to happen in here. She is mid-ground. These are lower in the picture plane. They're closer to us. She is lower in the picture plane than the structure in the back. We have linear perspective. We have lightness coming forward out of darkness and lightness coming forward out of darkness here. She kind of merges. This kind of comes forward and flattens. It competes with this on the same visual plane. So that does flatten space. It's a closed composition. It has a framing device added around it, and then we take a step out into the border area, and that is also another framing device. And then we go to the larger frame in frame, and there's a framing device there. And then we go to the larger border area, and there's repetition, there is scattering, and then there is a thin linear framing device around that. We see the initial cap, and it's framed, and the text box with the initial cap is also framed. Notice how the text gives an edge tension relationship to the frame of reference that it's sitting in, and the repetition, the stripes that the lines of type make help flatten the space. Same thing here. So even in this page design, this piece of graphic design, we have an overall sense of flat space because of all the spatial devices that are used. What do you see here? Overall, the space is volumetric with a lot of stylization. It uses a variety of spatial devices to create volumetric illusion or plastic space. One of those is planar recession. It's a little bit hard to see, but we do have a foreground plane. We have a plane behind it. There's another plane. There's the plane of the hills. There's the plane of the further hills. There's the plane of the sky. There's a bit of linear perspective going on. Eye level, by the way, is established here at the horizon, and so we understand that we're up here having just planted all of this, and now we're looking back over the vista. And so there is an eye level, there is perspective understanding, there's light areas coming forward out of darker areas, and darker areas coming forward out of lighter areas. Our eye will kind of tend to go right into this area overall, but we're kind of going to move through the whole thing. Notice that certain things repeat and help to reduce the sense of distance a little bit. We have all the foliage forms, the repeated curves and kind of loose circles and ovals are repeated all through, and the eye is going to pick those up, merge them all together in our perceptual understanding, and that will flatten space a little bit. But generally we have the sense of volume. It is an open composition. We've got the little bit of atmospheric perspective going on. It's lighter here, darker here, less detail back here, more detail down in here. The vertical placement, things are closer if they're lower in the picture plane because everything's below eye level. We've got a lot of overlapping issues. I think I mentioned open form, so forth. So this is a sense of volumetric illusion. And what do you see here? This is a textile design. Obviously, you see the repetition of color, repetition of the animal prints. A lot of things are about the same scale. There's nothing really larger, nothing really smaller. There's no perspective, there's no atmospheric perspective. There is repetition of color, there's repetition of shape, there's repetition of direction. There's patterns going through. And yes, in terms of this being a patch of something much larger, this is an open composition, an open form. But basically, we've got a lot of figure ground ambiguity going on. It's hard to pick out what's on top of what, and there's no real strong figure ground recognition being established. It's definitely flat space. Now, whether you'd want to, use this in an interior configuration would be entirely up to you, but it's flat space. And as we look at this illustration, what do you see here? There's changes in scale, larger figures versus smaller figures, larger camels versus smaller camels. Not a strong sense of linear perspective, but we do have diminishment, larger scale versus smaller scale. Things that are closer are larger, things that are further away are smaller. Notice also vertical placement. We have things lower in the picture plane are now closer to us, and things further away are higher. Notice how everything is outlined. We talked when we discussed shape last time that having things outlined all the way around does help to flatten space, makes it more cartoon, because when we look at something in actuality, there's no outlines around it. It is basically an edge recognition. Contours are recognized because they're a different color or a different degree of lightness or darkness from the surrounding area. And so we have these linear outlines that start to help flatten space. And we also have a closed composition. So there is a boundary that's actually drawn, which is part of the design. It's actually drawn around the active area. Notice how we have forced edge going on in here, where the blue and the gray of the hill actually start merging with that boundary line, with that frame of reference. Here it's visible, here it merges with the fill on those large shapes. That's a forced edge. So here we do have the illusion of volume that is more present than the flat spatial devices, but we recognize this definitely as a drawing or a painting. There's still a strong two-dimensional understanding.